Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I want to say I agree with the previous speaker that the greatest disaster, the greatest scandal perpetrated in Ireland was the armed struggle perpetrated by the IRA and Sinn Féin against the people of Ireland, and the many thousands of people who were killed and the many more thousands who were injured and had their lives destroyed. The Mahon Tribunal paints a picture of corruption and abuse of power endemic in Irish politics and largely in Fianna Fáil. Mahon found former Fianna Fáil Taoiseach Bertie Ahern to be untruthful. It found former EU Commissioner and Fianna Fáil Minister Pádraig Flynn to be corrupt. It found former Fianna Fáil Taoiseach Albert Reynolds to have abused power. It found former Fianna Fáil member Liam Lawler abused his role as a public representative. It found former Fianna Fáil Government Press Secretary Frank Dunlop made corrupt payments for developers to secure planning. It found that the Cork-based developer Owen O'Callaghan made or authorised corrupt payments to politicians for their support. But while the picture painted by the Mahon Tribunal is truly shocking, it is certainly not surprising to anyone who sat in the old Dublin County Council, as I did in the early 1990s. It merely confirms what I and many other Labour members of that council, people such as the Labour leader then, Frank Buckley, Ethna Fitzgerald and Mervyn Taylor, suspected at the time. It also won't come as a surprise to many of the journalists who covered the carry-on in Dublin County Council and elsewhere during that period. I do know now why the Labour Party didn't succeed in preventing the planning disaster that left some communities to this day bereft and limited in the facilities which they had paid for in purchasing their houses and paying their rent, but which they didn't get until very late in the day. It was because greedy developers sought to corrupt greedy politicians, and it was because greedy politicians, mainly from Fianna Fáil, sought to extort brown paper envelopes from those developers. The result was poor planning and devastated communities. Communities that paid on the double under the Fianna Fáil regime for instance, for school sites. The developers picked up the land and the options on sites that would become the future schools for next to nothing. The land was then rezoned, and then when it came to the school site being purchased, particularly in recent years, the cost of that land had risen to well over $500,000 an acre. That's why in Dublin West we're left with a lot of schools where children are urged to walk during playtime because there's almost no grounds available for playing and running freely. So that's a price that the children of this country, and particularly in development areas around County Dublin, like my own constituency, continue to pay. The Mahon Tribunal report, though, shows that money is the biggest persuader. That's why people like the Labour councillors couldn't make a successful argument that proper planning, because development was inevitable as the city was growing. The issue was how to strike the balance and to have a social dividend from development for the communities who were buying their houses and renting their houses in the new area. The Mahon report is only one of many reports which have uncovered dodgy dealings at the interface between business and politics over the last 20 years or so. Sometimes these reports merely confirm what has already been reported by journalists, some of whom have unfortunately been silenced as a result of libel threats from powerful people who do not want a media spotlight on some of their secretive dealings. I know a little bit about that myself because I received a lot of threatened libel actions, 42 I think in number, and you know, they were meant both to people like myself and to journalists to threaten, to silence and to cost people. Because even replying to those demands, as Deputy OD would know, cost many hundreds of pounds at the time. And they're meant to silence and they're meant to threaten, and we have to think about that. Sometimes people are a little bit blasé about how limitations on freedom of expression can be exercised. In an example way back, the Sunday Independent's Joe McAntony, in 1974, he reported that Ray Burke, then a newly elected Fianna Fáil TT, had received $15,000 for his role in helping rezone certain lands in Swords. But it wasn't until 1997 that Mr Burke was forced to resign, and it wasn't until 2002 that the Flood Tribunal found he had received corrupt payments from developers and others, and he eventually did serve some time in prison for tax offences. But other journalists, Matt Cooper, Cliff Taylor, Frank Connolly, Frank MacDonald, Mark Brannock, they all reported, Sam Smith, on payments to politicians, payments which were in many cases roundly denied both by the alleged donors and the alleged beneficiaries. But the McCracken Tribunal, the Flood Tribunal, the Moriarty Tribunal and now the Mahon Tribunal found that in many cases there was a sound basis for these reports. And that is notwithstanding the fact that the vast majority of people in politics from all parties and from none are absolutely honest in their dealings. Nonetheless, the people named in all of these reports have damaged the good name of politics in Ireland. It's true that a few of those named and shamed in some of these reports have eventually served some jail time, but many others seem to return to business as usual without suffering any serious consequences. And it does outrage ordinary citizens to witness successive scandals uncovered at enormous taxpayer expense, only to see some of the same characters and plot lines popping up again and again. The Moriarty Tribunal was established in 1997 to look into the financial affairs of former Taoiseach Charles Haughey and former Communications Minister Michael Lowry. The Moriarty's final report, published about this time last year, detailed the investigation into possible links between businessman Denis O'Brien and former Minister Michael Lowry, who awarded the second mobile phone licence to Mr O'Brien's consortium in 1995. The Moriarty report stated that it is beyond doubt that Mr Lowry imparted substantive information to Mr O'Brien, which was of significant value and assistance to him in securing the licence. The report also found that Mr O'Brien made or facilitated payments to Mr Lowry of a combined £447,000 and support for a loan of £420,000. The Taoiseach noted at the time of the publication of Moriarty that the tribunal had found seriously and serially against Deputy Michael Lowry and others who are major players in Irish business and public life. The Taoiseach quite rightly referred the Moriarty report to the Garda Commissioner, the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Revenue Commissioners. But there has been considerable public and political unease about the fact that Mr O'Brien has continued to pop up at various public events, most recently at the New York Stock Exchange. I would point out that the Taoiseach was invited by the New York Stock Exchange. It was the organisers, not the Taoiseach's office, who decided who was on the balcony for the bell-ringing ceremony at the Exchange. But it is perhaps now time for the government to reflect on how it should in future interact with people against whom adverse findings have been made by tribunals funded by the taxpayer, often at enormous expense. We do not want to return to the days of una duce, una voce politics of the former Fianna Fáil Taoiseach Charles J. Haughey, in the immortal words of his then press secretary P.J. Mara, himself something of a tribunal veteran, nor do we want in this country a Berlusconi-style media political complex with its attendant codes of omerta undermining the principles of a transparent democracy. And in this respect, I want to particularly welcome the statement made by my colleague, Minister Brendan Howlin, about the introduction of a whole set of further legislation dealing with the registration of lobbyists, dealing with the further developments of ethics for both public representatives and for office holders, and dealing with transparency in relation to public life, which is actually the absolutely critical issue. And I would say that in Ireland, We should look back to the 1830s in the United Kingdom, when the great Reform Acts were brought in, which cleaned up politics and ended the rotten boroughs for election to Parliament. We're in a republic, and the vote and the representation of each citizen should be what counts, not how much money a particular citizen has. I think we can look forward to a period of reform from this government, which I would hope will change the landscape, particularly in relation to the capacity to report and hold to account those who are lobbyists. I just want to finish on this. You know, the 10 Commandments, outlaw offences such as murder and envy and so on. It doesn't mean that we still don't have sin and problems. Similarly, what we need to do in this House is to legislate to create transparency and accountability from all publicly elected representatives, and particularly, obviously, from office holders.